The sound of a gavel echoed sharply through the courtroom as Judge Richard Wallace settled into his high-backed chair. The room was quiet, except for the faint rustling of papers and the whispers of those seated in the gallery. Marcus Hill, a young black man dressed in a neat gray suit, stepped forward when his case was called. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a spark of determination. He adjusted his tie and approached the bench with a file of papers in hand. "Your Honor," he began politely, "I'm here to contest a parking violation that I believe was issued in error." Judge Wallace barely glanced at him. With a dismissive wave of his hand, the judge cut Marcus off. "Isn't it interesting how everyone claims their tickets are issued in error these days?" the judge said with a smirk, his tone dripping with skepticism. Marcus blinked, but he didn't respond to the comment. Instead, he placed his documents on the table before him. "I have evidence to support my case, Your Honor. I believe the fine was unjustly applied. If you'll allow me." "I've heard enough," Judge Wallace interrupted again, his voice rising slightly. "Let's not waste time here. The fine is $500. Pay it, and we can all move on." The gallery shifted uncomfortably. A few people exchanged glances, sensing something was off. Marcus, however, stayed composed. He knew the judge's reputation well. Richard Wallace was known for being quick to pass judgment, especially when the defendant wasn't someone he considered respectable. Today, it seemed Marcus was no exception. "Your Honor," Marcus said evenly, "I request the chance to present my evidence. I believe it will make the situation clear." Judge Wallace leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel against the desk. "Evidence. Fine, let's see it. But I warn you, this better be good. My time is valuable." Marcus opened the file and handed over a neatly prepared document along with printed photographs. "This shows the parking sign was obscured by construction equipment at the time. There's also a record of the city issuing tickets in that area due to unclear signage." The judge took the papers but didn't bother to look at them. Instead, he glanced at Marcus with a condescending smile. "Do you think this little show is going to change anything? You parked illegally. That's all that matters." Marcus's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "With respect, Your Honor, the evidence doesn't matter," Judge Wallace snapped, cutting him off for the third time. He slammed his gavel onto the bench, causing a sharp crack to echo through the room. "The fine stands. $500, due immediately. Next case." For a moment, the room was silent. Marcus nodded slowly, gathering his papers without a word. As he turned to leave, whispers erupted among the crowd. Some people murmured about the judge's decision being unfair, while others simply shook their heads and moved on. Marcus walked out of the courtroom with a calm stride, but his mind was racing. This wasn't the first time he had seen someone in a position of power abuse it. He knew exactly what needed to be done. The judge had no idea who he was, and Marcus intended to keep it that way, at least for now. As Marcus Hill left the courthouse, he felt a mix of frustration and determination brewing inside him. The injustice he'd just witnessed wasn't surprising, but it was no less infuriating. It wasn't the fine itself, it was the attitude. Judge Richard Wallace had treated him like his voice didn't matter, like his evidence was worthless. Marcus had seen that kind of behavior too many times before. The courthouse steps were busy, people coming and going with a range of emotions written on their faces. Anger, relief, sadness. Marcus paused near the base of the steps and took a deep breath. He glanced at the courthouse behind him, its towering stone pillars a symbol of justice that too often didn't live up to its promise. Marcus wasn't an ordinary citizen who could be brushed aside easily. He was a federal prosecutor, a man who had dedicated his life to the law and ensuring it worked fairly for everyone. He thought back to the first time he realized how broken the system could be. Years ago, Marcus had been a law student working as an intern for a public defender's office. He'd witnessed countless cases where people were unfairly treated simply because they didn't have the resources or knowledge to defend themselves. One case stuck out in his memory. A single mother who was fined heavily for a housing violation that wasn't even her fault. She couldn't afford to pay and ended up losing her home. Marcus had tried to help her, but the system was stacked against her. It was then that Marcus had decided to make a difference, to become a voice for those who couldn't fight back. But even with his title and influence, there were moments like today, where he saw firsthand just how deeply bias could run. Judge Richard Wallace was no stranger to controversy. Marcus had heard whispers about the judge from colleagues. Wallace was known for being harsh and unyielding, particularly to people of color and those from low-income backgrounds. Complaints had been filed against him over the years, but nothing had ever stuck. Wallace knew how to play the system, keeping his biases hidden behind a mask of tough justice. As Marcus walked to his car, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He knew he couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been wronged by the same unfair practices. But he also knew he had to be smart. A direct confrontation wouldn't work. Judge Wallace was too entrenched in his position, too confident in his ability to brush off criticism. Marcus pulled out his phone and started making notes. He jotted down everything that had happened in the courtroom, every word the judge had said. He also added a list of steps he would take next. First, he'd file an official appeal. Then he'd start digging into the judge's history. He had connections in the legal world, people who had worked in Wallace's courtroom and might have stories to tell. Marcus was determined to uncover the truth, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under the judge's bias rulings. As he got into his car and drove away, his mind was already working through the strategy. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marcus Hill sat in his office the next morning, staring at the stack of case files on his desk. The familiar hum of the city outside his window provided a distant backdrop as he thought about the events of the previous day. He had been a federal prosecutor for 5 years, but the feeling of helplessness he'd felt in that courtroom still lingered. It wasn't just the fine. It was the blatant disregard for his rights. It was the way Judge Wallace had assumed Marcus was just another person to be brushed aside. But Marcus wasn't the kind of person to back down easily. He knew how the system worked, and he knew that, with patience and persistence, he could make things right. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was someone who fought for fairness, for justice, for those who couldn't always defend themselves. Yesterday, in that courtroom, he had been treated like he didn't matter. But he wasn't about to let it end there. As he sat at his desk, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. It was his colleague, Lisa Johnson, another prosecutor who had been in the office for nearly a decade. Lisa was sharp, resourceful, and had seen enough of Judge Wallace's courtroom antics to know how corrupt he could be. "Hey Lisa, it's Marcus. We need to talk about Judge Wallace." Lisa answered immediately, her voice concerned. "What happened? I heard something went down yesterday." "I'm sure you did. The judge fined me $500 for a parking ticket, even though I had evidence that it was issued wrongly. I'm filing an appeal, but I want to dig deeper. He's been getting away with this for too long." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I knew something didn't sit right about that guy. I've seen him be unfair with others before. He has a pattern. I'm going to make sure this gets the attention it deserves. I need you to help me look into his past rulings. Find out if anyone else has filed complaints against him. Anything that could point to a pattern of discrimination or bias. "I'm on it," Lisa replied without hesitation. "You're not going to let this slide, huh?" "Not a chance," Marcus said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'll make sure the truth comes out." The conversation ended, and Marcus sat back in his chair. The plan was clear in his mind. First, he would follow through with the appeal. But more importantly, he would start digging into Judge Wallace's history. Marcus knew that this wouldn't be easy. Judges like Wallace didn't usually get called out for their actions. But he was different. He had the knowledge, the connections, and the willpower to take down someone who thought they were untouchable. As the day went on, Marcus kept working, but his mind remained focused on his goal, He knew the road ahead wouldn't be quick or easy. It could take weeks or even months before the full truth came to light. But that didn't matter to him. What mattered was that the system worked the way it was supposed to. What mattered was that he could make a difference. With a quiet resolve, Marcus made a promise to himself. He would hold Judge Wallace accountable, no matter what it took. And this time, he wouldn't let anyone ignore the truth. Marcus woke up early the next day, his mind already buzzing with plans. It was a new day, but the task ahead was the same: to uncover the truth about Judge Wallace's biased rulings and show the world what he had seen firsthand in that courtroom. The first step was clear. Marcus needed to file an official appeal for the parking fine. But he wasn't going to stop there. He had a feeling that the judge's actions weren't isolated. This wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was about a pattern of behavior that needed to be exposed. After a long day of paperwork, Marcus sat down in his office, surrounded by case files and his computer. He pulled up the court records of Judge Wallace, searching through his past rulings. The more Marcus dug, the more disturbed he became. There were multiple cases where Wallace had given harsh sentences for minor offenses, especially when the defendant was from a lower income or minority background. But there was something more troubling. Marcus discovered that Wallace had been reprimanded in the past for his conduct, though nothing had ever come of it. There were several complaints from defense attorneys and even other judges, but the system had protected him. It was clear that Wallace knew how to play the system, but Marcus wasn't about to let him get away with it anymore. Marcus made a note to contact Lisa. She had promised to help, and now he needed her expertise. Within an hour, Lisa called back. "I've got some interesting info," she said. "I've dug through the archives, and you're right. Wallace has been flagged multiple times for biased rulings. There's even a complaint about him from 5 years ago regarding his treatment of a black defendant. It didn't go anywhere, but it's enough to make people start asking questions." Marcus felt a wave of frustration mixed with hope. This is exactly what I needed. We can't let this slide. We need to expose him, but carefully. If we're going to make a difference, we need more than just complaints. We need evidence. The two of them spent the next several hours going through court records, digging deeper into every case Wallace had presided over. They found more than they had expected. Multiple instances of questionable rulings, fines that were too steep, and sentences that seemed out of proportion to the crimes committed. It was clear that Judge Wallace wasn't just a harsh judge, he was biased. And that bias had cost many people their chance at fair treatment in court. By the end of the day, Marcus had a stack of documents ready for the appeal. But he knew it wasn't enough to simply present the evidence to the court. He needed to make sure that the people who needed to hear it would listen. That meant going public. He'd contact a journalist he trusted to help spread the word. But first, he had to ensure everything was in place. This was just the beginning. As the sun set outside his office window, Marcus looked at the pile of work in front of him. He was tired, but the fire within him burned brighter than ever. He wasn't going to let this judge's actions go unchallenged. He wasn't going to let the system continue to fail those who needed it most. The downfall of Judge Wallace had already begun. Marcus was ready to take the next step. Marcus stood in front of the courthouse once again. But this time, he wasn't there just to contest a fine. His heart was racing as he walked through the familiar steps. The air was thick with anticipation. Today, he was ready to reveal something that would make the public, and Judge Wallace, take notice. The past few days had been a whirlwind. Marcus had spent hours gathering evidence, reviewing court cases, and collaborating with Lisa. They had uncovered the truth. Judge Wallace had a long history of biased rulings that disproportionately affected minority defendants. But now it was time to make that truth known. He wasn't going to let his work go unnoticed. Marcus had already filed the official appeal for the parking fine, but he knew that wasn't enough. He needed to confront the judge publicly, to show the world the kind of man Wallace truly was. And Marcus had a plan. As Marcus entered the courtroom, the air felt different. There was a certain energy today, a feeling that something big was about to happen. He walked to the front, taking his place at the defendant's table. Judge Wallace was already seated at the bench, his eyes scanning the room as if he owned the space. The usual smirk played on his lips when he saw Marcus. "Back again, I see. Did you bring more evidence to waste my time with?" the judge asked in his usual condescending tone. Marcus didn't flinch. He had expected this. With a calm, steady voice, he responded, "Actually, Your Honor, I have something more important to share today. Something that the people in this room need to hear." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "What are you talking about?" Marcus looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the few people who had gathered for the case. It was time. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce myself properly. My name is Marcus Hill. I am a federal prosecutor, and I've been investigating your past rulings for a while now." The room fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the shuffle of papers on the bench as Judge Wallace stared at Marcus, completely taken aback. He hadn't expected this. Marcus continued, his voice strong and clear. "I found multiple complaints and records of biased rulings that have been ignored by this court. I spent days looking through your cases, and it's clear that your judgments are not made based on the law, but on your personal biases." Judge Wallace's expression shifted from confidence to shock. His usual arrogance melted away as Marcus presented the evidence they had gathered. He showed the court records, the complaints filed against the judge, and examples of cases where Wallace had handed down unfair sentences. The room watched in stunned silence as the truth came out. "This isn't just about me," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the room. "This is about the people who've been treated unfairly, the ones who don't have the power to fight back. I'm here to make sure that justice is served, not just for myself, but for everyone who's been wronged." Judge Wallace opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air, and for the first time, the judge was speechless. The courtroom was filled with a tension that was palpable. The power dynamics had shifted. It wasn't just a prosecutor versus a judge anymore. It was the truth versus a man who had spent years hiding behind his title. Marcus stood tall, knowing that this was only the beginning. He had started a fight for justice, and he wasn't about to back down. The courtroom was still, the silence heavy with the weight of what Marcus had just revealed. The air felt thick, almost electric, as everyone waited for Judge Wallace to speak. He had been caught off guard, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed uncertain of what to do next. Marcus stood confidently, his hands resting calmly on the table in front of him. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, but he didn't flinch. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to the people in the room, and the people who would hear about this later, to decide what would happen next. For a few seconds, Judge Wallace just stared at Marcus, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. The usual smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped frown. The judge finally cleared his throat, looking down at the papers in front of him. His fingers shook slightly as he held them, but his voice, when it came, was forced and cold. "This is absurd," Judge Wallace muttered. "You have no right to come in here and accuse me like this." Marcus didn't back down. He had expected the judge to lash out, to try to save face. It was what people in positions of power did when they were exposed. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side, and he wasn't going to let Wallace's anger intimidate him. "I have every right, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his tone calm but firm. "I've presented the evidence. I've shown this court that you've been unfair to the people you're supposed to serve. I'm not the only one who's been wronged by your actions, and I won't stand by while it continues." For the first time, Judge Wallace looked around the room, his eyes darting from one person to another. He saw the looks of disbelief on the faces of the court staff, the other lawyers, and even the few members of the public who had been present in the gallery. His usual power, the authority he had wielded with ease, was slipping away. People were starting to see him for what he really was. Marcus's words had struck a chord. Wallace knew that the truth had been laid out in front of everyone. The complaints, the biased rulings, the evidence, it was all there. He couldn't deny it, no matter how much he wanted to. For the first time in his career, the judge felt vulnerable, exposed. The silence in the room stretched on. Marcus stood tall, waiting. He had done what he set out to do. He had shown the world the truth. But now, it was up to the system to decide whether it would do the right thing. Judge Wallace shifted in his seat, but instead of responding with anger, he took a deep breath. "I need to review these allegations," he said, his voice quieter now. "I will consider your appeal." Marcus nodded, his expression unwavering. "I trust you will, Your Honor. But I also trust that the truth will be heard." With that, Marcus turned and walked toward the door. He didn't need to say any more. The message had been sent. The judge's actions had been exposed, and now the world would see him for who he truly was. It was just the beginning, and Marcus was ready for whatever came next. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus's revelation in the courtroom had sent shockwaves through the legal community. News outlets picked up the story, and the once untouchable Judge Wallace was suddenly under intense scrutiny. Marcus had expected some pushback, but even he hadn't anticipated how quickly things would escalate. He sat in his office late one afternoon, reviewing his case files when his phone rang. It was Lisa. "Marcus, I've got news," she said, her voice urgent. "I've just spoken to a reporter. They're interested in covering the full story about Wallace, not just your case. It's big, Marcus. Bigger than we thought." Marcus sat up, feeling a surge of excitement and apprehension. "What do you mean, bigger?" "The complaints against Wallace go way beyond your case. He's been accused of unfair rulings in at least a dozen cases over the past 5 years. Some of those cases were dismissed by higher courts, but others never even made it past his bench. This could go national." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. This was what he'd been working toward. The truth was finally coming to light, and the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. As the days passed, the pressure on Judge Wallace mounted. The complaints and evidence that had been quietly filed away in the past were now being taken seriously. Lawyers, legal experts, and even former colleagues of Wallace began to speak out, sharing their own experiences and concerns. It became clear that the judge had used his position to manipulate the system for years. Meanwhile, Marcus stayed focused. He knew that this was more than just about one judge. It was about making sure the system worked for everyone, no matter their background. He had spent years fighting for justice, and now he was seeing the fruits of his labor. But even as the pressure on Wallace grew, Marcus remained cautious. He knew that things wouldn't change overnight. The fight was far from over. Then came the call that Marcus had been waiting for. It was the court system itself. "Mr. Hill, this is the office of the Judicial Review Board." The voice on the other end said, "We've reviewed your case, along with the additional allegations you've brought forward. After careful consideration, we have decided to launch a full investigation into Judge Wallace's conduct." Marcus felt a rush of relief. He had known that the truth would eventually win out, but hearing those words made it real. Judge Wallace would have to answer for his actions. The people who had been wronged by him, people like Marcus, and so many others, were finally going to get the justice they deserved. As the investigation into Wallace deepened, the media coverage grew. It wasn't just local news anymore. It was national. More stories came to light. Stories about people who had been unfairly treated by Wallace and had never had the chance to fight back. It became a movement, a call for change in the system. Marcus's decision to speak out had started a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The powerful were being held accountable, and for the first time in a long time, the system was beginning to correct itself. For Marcus, this wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for all those who had been ignored or mistreated. He had stood up, and now the world was listening. Weeks passed, and the investigation into Judge Wallace's conduct continued. The story had spread far and wide. and more people came forward with their own experiences of unfair treatment at the hands of the once respected judge. The public outrage grew stronger, and it seemed like everyone was waiting for justice to be served. Marcus had always believed in the power of the law, but this case had shown him just how important it was for people to stand up for what was right. He had taken a stand, and it had made a difference. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, was now exposed for all to see. The investigation into Judge Wallace was thorough, and it didn't take long before more details emerged. He had made countless rulings based on personal biases, disregarding the law in favor of his own prejudices. His decisions were not just mistakes. They were deliberate actions that hurt people and cost them their chance at fair treatment. In the end, the Judicial Review Board found enough evidence to recommend that Judge Wallace be removed from his position. The decision was final, and Judge Wallace was disbarred. His career, built on years of biased rulings, had come to an end. Marcus stood in front of his office window as the news broke on TV. He had expected a feeling of triumph, but instead, he felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. The system had worked as it was meant to. It had taken time, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. But even as Wallace's downfall was being reported across the nation, Marcus knew that the work wasn't done. The system was still flawed, still vulnerable to the same biases that had allowed Wallace to thrive for so long. This victory was just one small step in a much larger fight for fairness. The case had sparked a larger conversation about the need for reform in the judicial system. People began talking more openly about the importance of accountability and transparency in the courts. Marcus, having spent so much time in the trenches of the legal world, knew that this was just the beginning. But now, there was hope. Lisa, who had helped him throughout the process, called him that evening. "You did it, Marcus. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about everyone who's ever been wronged by the system. I couldn't have done it without your help." Marcus replied, his voice steady. "We did it together." "It's just the start, though," Lisa said. "We've got a lot more work to do, but today we've proven that change is possible, and that matters." Marcus smiled as he looked out at the city lights twinkling below. It had been a long road, but he felt a sense of peace now that justice had been served. He had stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. And in the end, it was worth it. The fight for justice would continue, but Marcus knew one thing for sure. The truth would always find its way to the surface, no matter how hard some tried to bury it. And as long as he had a voice, Marcus Hill would keep fighting.